Good evening. Welcome to the fall program of the 40th Annual Greater Lafayette Holocaust Remembrance Conference. I'm Sarah Powley. I am the chair of the Greater Lafayette Holocaust Remembrance Committee. On this date, December 9th, in 1948, following World War II, the United Nations approved the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. World War II was not the first time the world had seen genocide, and sadly, it has not been the last. Our speaker tonight, Jordan Stephen Sher, will discuss his recently published book, And Still We Rise, a story inspired by the experiences of survivors of the genocide in Bosnia in 1992. He will provide historical context for those atrocities. A former social worker and teacher, Jordan Stephen Sher is a member of the working group of Bosnia and Herzegovina and a member of the international expert team, Council Institute for the Research of Genocide in Canada. Following Mr. Sher's presentation, Nick Schenkel, director of the West Lafayette Public Library, will converse with our author. That conversation will be followed by a question and answer opportunity facilitated by Associate Professor Rebecca Klein-Pashova of the Department of History at Purdue University and the Program Director for the Human Rights Program at Purdue. Again, thank you for joining us. And now, Jordan Stephen Sher, speaking to us from his home in California.
Thank you. First of all, I really want to thank the committee for inviting me here today. It is much appreciated and an honor, actually, to be doing this. I know this is your 40th anniversary of doing such conferences. So again, it's an honor to be here. Thank you. So the presentation I'm going to give really is to serve as backdrop for what happened during the genocide in Bosnia in the early 1990s, but also to provide universal lessons, which I think you can certainly draw some, conclusions for what happens when authoritarian governments and fascist regimes are present in a country. So I think you'll find some commonalities, certainly. So let me move forward. First of all, I want to point out on the map here what Bosnia and Herzegovina look like today. And please note there is Croatia to the north and Serbia to the east. And on the map for Bosnia and Herzegovina, please note Republica Srpska here, and that will come into prominent play later. And the Bosnia and Herzegovina is in Central Europe, just for a point of reference. Okay. The man pictured here is Slobodan Milovic, who actually died in prison in 2006, awaiting further trial, I guess. He had been tried and was in prison, but conviction had not necessarily come about. But in this speech in 1989, he's commemorating the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. And this is at a monument called Gazimestan. And the speech at the monument, there were approximately 1 million, mostly ethnic Serbs, attending. And in the speech, he said, like in the battle, we will defend Christian Europe against encroaching Muslim Turks. He calls for a unified Serb nation with Serbs of all republics in Yugoslavia, and at the time there were 6 republics in Yugoslavia. And he makes reference to the, quote, possibility of armed battles for the future of Serbia's national development. Now, this sets the tone for demonization of non-Serbs in Yugoslavia, especially Bosniaks, and Bosniaks are Bosnian Muslims, and this will become a key element of his nationalist propaganda campaign. He continues to spur ultranationalism in Serbia within all republics, and this becomes an us versus them proposition. Again, we've seen that in many other places in the world and our country. In 1991, there was a referendum for independence in Croatia and Slovenia. So they were splitting from Yugoslavia. And Milovic, who was president of Serbia at the time, but really, in a sense, president of Yugoslavia, had his military invade Slovenia and Croatia. Slovenia, the military stayed for about 10 days. That's all. But they remained in Croatia for a few years. Okay. And then at this time in 1991, late 1991, the JNA, which is Yugoslav People's Army, is secretly supplying weapons to a Bosnian Serb army that is forming. Let me step back to the Battle of Kosovo, and why is this a significant event for nationalist Serbs? The Serbian kingdom was defeated as a part of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans assumed control of Serbia. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was spreading Islam throughout Asia Minor and parts of Europe. The Serbian army leader, a man named Prince Lazar, was killed in the battle, and the Orthodox Christian Church of Serbia interpreted this almost like a Last Supper, where Serbia's Prince Lazar was seen as having sacrificed himself to preserve Serbia in heaven as the bulwark of Christianity. Now, the battle becomes mythological and going forward, and it's embedded in the national consciousness of Serbia. Milovic himself was called a little Lazar because he was seen as willing to sacrifice himself, like Prince Lazar did, for the good of Serbia. Now, let's move way forward to World War II. To begin with, the Ustasha was a fascist movement that began in Croatia in the 1920s. During World War II, however, they formed a government and aligned with the Axis powers, which is Germany and Italy. They committed genocide to create a purely Croatian state. Now, they were quite brutal, and I truly mean, if you do some research on the Ustasha, you will find out how brutal the death squads were. They had concentration camps, including one that was infamous, and upwards of 70,000 people killed in this concentration camp called Jasenovac. They murdered between 300,000 and 600,000 ethnic Serbs in the region, 30,000 Jews, and 29,000 Roma in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Serbs had, through their royalist Yugoslavian army, created what were called the Chetniks. And the Chetniks also aligned with the Axis powers, but they were mostly focused on the partisans. And the partisans were communists and wanting to create a communist Yugoslav state. But the Chetniks also engaged in ethnic cleansing of Croats and Bosniaks in Bosnia and Croatia, and toward the goal of a greater Serbia. And they are said to have murdered upwards of 68,000 people, mostly Bosniaks. So now you have events such as the Battle of Kosovo, mass killings of Serbs in World War II, and the end of a push for greater Serbia following a defeat by the partisans after World War II. And by the way, it was kind of strange because Ustasha and Chetniks were supposed to be enemies, and yet the Ustasha were secretly supplying support to the Chetniks in their bid to cleanse the region of non-Serbs. In any event, so these events, following the defeat of the partisans, and these events are embedded deep within ultranationalist sense of victimhood. And continued to push toward the creation of a greater Serbia. These seed the ultranationalist movement in the late 1980s and lead to the genocide, which in Bosnia, Herzegovina, which began in 1992. By the way, CBIH, that is for Bosnia Herzegovina. Okay, let's move to communist Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia had 6 republics in the one nation. Josip Broz Tito was the strongman who led Yugoslavia from 1945 to 1980. The country moved from communism to more of a socialist regime. And I've spoken to a number of people who said either their parents or they themselves living in Yugoslavia found it to be a relatively open society. And when I've spoken to survivors, they have said to me that there's sort of a nostalgic look at what Yugoslavia was and what it felt like to be there. Now, there was peaceful coexistence among all religions, and that was the norm. In fact, religion was quietly celebrated, because communism was at the foundation of the state. But intermarriage became more prevalent prior to the genocide. In fact, 18% of marriages were of mixed ethnicity and religion. So again, we see republics beginning to gain independence in the early 90s. At the same time, Serb ethno-nationalism, as you saw in the speech from 1989, but Serb ethno-nationalism is particularly on the rise. Now, I want to give you a sense of demographics before the genocide. So in 1991, there were 4.4 million people in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 43% were Bosniaks, 31% Orthodox Christian Serbs, and 70% Catholic Croats, and then 9% others. And that others is kind of important today because these are people who even today, the others, maybe people who just identify as Bosnians or Roma or Jews, actually today are not constitutionally, do not have the same rights as the 3 constituent groups. But this is what it looked like in terms of the census. Okay, so Bosnia and Herzegovina have a referendum for independence, and that passes. And in March 1st of 1992, they are an independent state or nation, and they separate from Yugoslavia as well, and it's recognized by the U.S. and others. Slobodan Milosevic, Radovan Karadzic, who was the political leader and one of the architects of the genocide, but he's political leader of the Bosnian Serbs, and Ratko Mladic, general of the Bosnian Serb army, lead an ethnic cleansing campaign to rid Bosnia of Bosniaks and Catholic Croats. Now, at the time, many Bosnian Serb neighbors, because they buy into this very heavy propaganda and rhetoric by Milosevic and Karadzic and others, start turning on their Bosniak neighbors in Bosnia. So the rhetoric and propaganda work. Primarily, Bosniaks are being seen as Muslim extremists and terrorists. And Milosevic and Karadzic knew how to play this because, and I'll give you just quick little anecdote. When I taught middle school and I taught 7th grade social studies, and we did a unit on Islam. And the very first question I'd ask my students is, what do you think of when you think of the word Muslim? And you can bet that 99% said terrorists. So this certainly, unfortunately, the stereotype was reinforced by the ultranationalists in Serbia and in Bosnian Serbs. Okay, so many of these same neighbors end up enjoying police reservists, or they become guards in concentration camps, or they're simply bystanders, or they turn in their neighbors to the authorities. So it was quite something. And the people that I've spoken with who survived this were rather shocked because again in the 80s, there was quite a peaceful coexistence, and they really never saw their neighbors turning on them the way they did. Now, on April 7th, Bosnian Serb army begins shelling in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, and they invade towns in eastern Bosnia with large Bosniak populations. Now, I want to reference here Omarska, Karaturm, and Ternopilje. Prijedor is still a municipality in northwestern Bosnia. Today, it's part of Republica Srpska, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. It is also the place that my book begins. And there were concentration camps set up in Prijedor. They began mostly in late May of 1992. The three most notorious are Omarska, and this is a picture of Omarska. It was actually a functioning iron ore mining company, and that's the building. That large building was called the hangar. And in the hangar were various offices and storage spaces that the prisoners were kept. I'll get to the other building in just a minute and describe that. But Omarska was a brutal concentration camp of torture and murder, certainly. It is currently owned by the largest steelmaker in the world, ArcelorMittal, based in London. And they're not very cooperative in terms of commemoration. I personally can't imagine working at a place that had such horrific events go on there. Karaturm is on the outskirts of the city of Prijedor, which is in the municipality of Prijedor. And Karaturm was a ceramics company, actually. But it was turned into quite a brutal concentration camp. And then Ternopilje is actually the name of a little town, a little village, but it also describes the primary school that was turned into concentration camp. Okay, and as we all unfortunately know, concentration camps include imprisonment, torture, murder, rape, and mass graves. People who were killed in these concentration camps were put into mass graves, and that was to conceal the crimes of the perpetrators. Okay, so atrocities are rampant. The war, the genocidal campaign had begun in April. It spread in mid to late May, early May to late May in Prijedor region. There was widespread burning of villages and cities, murder, rape, looting, torture, and displacement now throughout Bosnia. I put this picture because Kozarac is actually the second largest city in Prijedor. Again, the municipality, like a county in this country, but Prijedor also was the name of the largest city, which had about 50,000 people. Kozarac had roughly 27,000 people. And again, if you read my book, you will see how Kozarac really is the citizens of Kozarac are slaughtered, essentially, as in late May, as the invasion happens in their community, in their town. Now, the other thing I want you to note is that there were brutal militias. These were crime gangs that the government in Belgrade, Serbia, was supporting. There's not time, I suppose, to tell you some of the things that I know about what these gangs did, but it was quite vicious. It was quite vicious. So they were part of this whole military incursion. There were concentration camps set up throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina, not certainly just in Prijedor, but throughout. And then there was a resistance that formed. In fact, I interviewed a man who helped to start the resistance in Sarajevo, and they were getting guns through the black market and other places, because at the time that Bosnia became an independent country, it had no army. So after a few months, the resistance turned into and became a more organized and formal army, and the actual war between Bosnia and Serbia ensued. Now, I just want to show you a system of the concentration camps. Please note up here, this is Prijedor. But there were over 200 camps, and those are just the ones that were identified. There were others, and I interviewed a man once who was a military policeman, and he and colleagues were captured, and they were brought to a small town, and they were put in houses. Now that is not, and they were concentration camps. They were brutalized in these houses. But that is certainly, you will not see that on this map. So there were more than the 200, I will bet. Now, some of you have heard about the Srebrenica genocide. In 1992, 70,000 Bosniaks in the municipality of Srebrenica fled towards the city of Srebrenica. And these were, primarily Bosniak villagers, and they were small villages. And remember, the military would go into these villages, and actually in Srebrenica, there were over 300 villages that were attacked by the Bosnian Serb military. And folks, these people fled towards Srebrenica city. And at the time, the Bosnian Serbs who lived in the city, and by the way, the city previously had 35,000 residents. So this is 70,000 people fleeing toward it or to it. Bosnian Serbs had left, knowing that the Bosnian Serb military is attacking. The Bosniaks who had fled end up moving into abandoned buildings, also buildings at this point now that are being shelled. There were 15, 20, 25 people in one 3-bedroom apartment, for example, or a small house. And then the supplies are cut off. There's shelling going on. There are people being killed, buildings being bombed, until a supposed safe area, UN safe area, emerges beginning March of 1993. And there was a Canadian contingent of peacekeepers, roughly 500, and they were in place to at least stall the Bosnian Serb army from attacking further. And that happened, but there was a food scarcity. Supplies were cut off because the Bosnian Serb army was still in the surrounding hills. Electricity was not very readily available, neither was water. Here's where the genocide occurs. It was roughly July 6th. And those of you who saw Quo Vadis Aida, you have a sense of what happened. It was an excellent film. If you haven't seen it, you ought to, because it's a very, very accurate depiction of what happened leading up to the genocide in Srebrenica. So on July 6th or so, Mladic, the general of the Bosnian army, he comes into Potocari, which is the city that the UN headquarters was for. At that point now, it was Dutch peacekeepers. They had taken over from the Canadians. And there's sort of a false negotiations. Mladic knew what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was, as he put it, revenge against the Turks. And he really had the intention of slaughtering particularly men and boys in Srebrenica. So the peacekeepers, Dutch peacekeepers, were unable to do anything to stop him. Some say they were unwilling. But again, if you see the movie, I think you'll get a very good sense of what actually happened. So women and children certainly were killed, but the targets were men and boys. Many fled into the woods, knowing that they were being targeted, but the Bosnian Serb military army chased them down, killed many in the forest, in the woods, brought others back, and put them in the municipality, in schools, in factories, on soccer fields, and summarily executed them. Now, the women and children at the time, Mladic had buses and trucks come in and take the women and children to a city called Tuzla, which was actually at the time in control of the Bosnian army, and it was about 60 miles from there. Then there were men and boys who did escape and did make it to Tuzla safely. I know personally men who did, but most did not make it. Okay, let's look at genocide and what the definition is, and I appreciate Sarah mentioning that early, that in 1948, the United Nations adopted its Convention on Genocide, whereby its definition includes various harmful acts with committed intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, religious group as such. So, and the reason I bring that slide to you is that I believe that this was a genocidal campaign. It was not ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing was actually termed by Milovic. And the intent was there to eliminate Bosniaks in particular, but certainly Catholic Croats as well, who were in the minority in Bosnia, but Bosniaks. It's estimated that 25 to 35,000 Bosniaks were murdered, and these are civilians during the war. 1,875 Bosnian Croats, 7,480 Bosnian Serbs were killed. Bosniak men and boys particularly were targeted for murder, and there were 20,000 to 50,000 women and girls raped. This was a horrific tool of war. And again, I've spoken to people and know of people who, at least their family members, this happened to, and it's just, it's gruesome, of course. And over 1,000 religious sites were destroyed. This, to me, constitutes a genocide. Hundreds of thousands were displaced. 2 million Bosniaks are living in the Balkans, and 1 million settled and are living in and around the world. There are roughly 300,000 Bosniaks here in the States. Now, this is my friend Satya Muyajic, and this is a few years ago. Satko wrote the foreword for my book, and he was quite instrumental in helping me to understand what it was like to be in a concentration camp, because he himself spent 3 months in Omarska with his father, actually, and another 3+ months in another concentration camp called Manjača. Now, the Satko's standing in front of the White House, as it was called, and the White House was the most notorious place for torture at the complex of Omarska. One knew if one was selected to, or anyone selected for torture in the White House, often never returned. Some certainly did, but it was a brutal place. Now, Satko he's quite an activist now, and he's part of a group that annually commemorates the closure of Omarska August 6th. But it's really ludicrous in a way, because it's in Omarska is in Prijedor, which is controlled now by Republica Srpska, which are Bosnian Serb political leaders, and I'll get into that in a bit more. But the ridiculous nature of this is that those who commemorate can spend about 4 hours at Omarska. They can put a small plaque in the window for those 4 hours. They release white balloons to commemorate all those that were killed at Omarska. And then the plaque is taken down, and there's really no other memorialization or commemoration for what happened in Omarska. Now, the Dayton Peace Accords did what they were to do, which is stop the war. Okay. And in fact, that anniversary is coming up in the next few days. However, it gave Bosnian Serbs Republika Srpska. And roughly, I'll show you a map in just a sec, but roughly 49% of the land is controlled by Bosnian Serbs in Republika Srpska. It did establish what was called the Office of the High Representative. And that's an office that oversees the Dayton Peace Accords, make sure that they're followed. But this really was, well, let me get to this. It set up Dayton set up an unmanageable tripartite central government. And today there's very poor economy and corruption. So unfortunately, what Dayton did was it was not a formula for uniting a fractured nation. Bosnia and Herzegovina consists of 3 constituent peoples, and I mentioned those again: Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. 2 entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska, in one state, but there's no shared vision of the present or future. And there's quite a bit of tension today, and I'll get into that in just a moment. And the region's quite divided. The existence of RS as it's called, Republica Srpska, RS itself continues the genocidal war by political means with the aim of achieving ethnic homogeneity. So Dayton, in a sense, legitimized the success of the genocide by rewarding the aggressors with an entity. Now, here's a map. You can see the pink represents land of Republica, the entity of Republika Srpska, and the blue is a federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, the ICTY, Criminal Tribunal, was the first crime court created by the UN since Nuremberg and the Tokyo tribunals. And it gave victims a platform to speak of the horrors, and it held the architects of the genocide accountable. But still, there are many criminals that roam free. So in a sense, the non-architects, prison guards, police, militias, I mean, certainly some were held accountable, but there are many that roam free, and particularly in Republika Srpska. So where there are still Bosniaks who returned, they, for example, might be, and I've read stories and talked to folks there, you might be sipping coffee at a cafe, and you could look across, and the prison guard who tortured you is also sipping coffee and reading a newspaper. So you can imagine how disturbing that is for survivors. The only crime that the ICTY deemed a genocide was Srebrenica. The others were crimes against humanity and other war crimes, or being part of a joint criminal enterprise. But other than Srebrenica, there are no other crimes deemed genocide. Now, one of the major problem, really, well, there are many major problems. A major problem today for any sort of peace is the genocide denial, the historical revisionism and glorification of war heroes by many in Serbia and the government in Serbia and the Republika Srpska government there. So it's this denial is heavily embedded in RS and Serbia, and perversely, they view that theirs was a war of liberation, and it's reflected in RS memorializations. So Mladic, remember the general of the Bosnian Serb army, is being glorified on billboards, murals, graffiti in Republika Srpska and Serbia. So you can see here in this picture, and this is just a few weeks ago, at a Muslim cemetery, somebody etched in it's graffiti, but a picture of Mladic. And so this is on, in a sacred cemetery. So you can imagine then how psychologically intimidating this is for survivors, particularly people living in Republika Srpska. It is certainly representative of discrimination against Bosniaks who returned to their homes in what is now Republika Srpska, and it perpetuates the trauma caused by the atrocities. Okay, so there's competing ethnocentric education systems. There are history books in RS that speak of the glories of their heroes. There's a recent law against denial. The Office of the High Representative criminalized, and that's his role, but criminalized before he left office, genocide, denial, and glorification and hate speech, but it's not being pursued vigorously. In fact, Milorad Dodik, who is essentially a political leader, and he's in the presidency in Sarajevo as part of the tripartite, he's quite heated up his inflammatory rhetoric, and he's flaunting and trying to challenge the new law. And so far, nothing has happened to him. Now, it's critical to have memorialization at former concentration camps and villages and cities, similar to the Srebrenica Memorial Center, which is kind of like a Holocaust museum in Srebrenica. But in RS, there are none of those. There are statues and there are murals that glorify their heroes. Now, hard road to navigate. I just wanted to, many of you know the definition of trauma. It is up here. I also want to mention about re-traumatization, which, again, for example, in the Muslim cemetery, when one sees this, it's going to re-traumatize the survivors. And there are many things that still act to re-traumatize survivors. I will tell you, though, that I have met many survivors who are quite resilient and have established wonderful lives, both in Bosnia and in the diaspora. But the trauma really never leaves them. And I want to just kind of finish this with a quote from Dr. David Pettigrew, who's a pretty amazing man. And he said, the survivors of the genocide have kept their hearts open to the hope that the truth will lead to justice. The question is, finally, whether the international community will honor that hope. Because right now that is not being seen, that there is a very significant crisis once again in Bosnia for the people who live there. And we can get into more of that if you have questions. So lastly, I'm doing my part to give voice to truth, and I am doing that through the book that recently was published and still we rise. And I know that we will be getting into discussion about that in just a minute. So I want to thank you very much for your patience and for listening.
Thank you for joining us tonight, Jordan. It was a pleasure to talk with you earlier this week, so that we have some understanding of each other. A quick introduction of myself. My name is Nick Shankle. I'm the director here at the West Lafayette Public Library. I'm a longtime book reviewer for our local NPR radio station. So I found this book particularly moving, and I'm very glad to be engaging in some conversation with you about it tonight. I gotta say, and I say this in my review, I found Still We Rise a book I couldn't put down once I got into the story. There were many times I wanted to put it down because what is described in here, in the first half especially, is oftentimes quite horrific. But the characters really pulled me in, and I wanted to know what happened to these people. I wanted to know how they could survive and how they would survive. And I don't want to give away the rest of our conversation here, but just to thank you as a reader for a really powerful presentation. Which brings me to my first question that I thought we'd converse about a bit. Why a novel? You just presented a really in-depth presentation of the Bosnian genocide in the 90s, and you chose to write the book as a novel, which, as I said, I really enjoyed. Is there a particular reason you went with fiction?
You know, that is a very good question. I can consider it historical fiction, and when I promote it, I say it is a truth-based fiction. Mm-hmm. To be honest and frank, I had written prior to that an as told to memoir for somebody who had survived the genocide, and that person, and understandably at the end, their family was uncomfortable with having it published, and I absolutely understand that. So I decided to write a novel saying, well, I'll have more control over this. However, Satya Muyajic, who I introduced you to, is a very exacting man. And we had numerous Zoom calls. He lives in Brussels. And he held my feet to the fire. So whereas I thought writing a novel would give me more freedom, actually it didn't. But I think because of Satko, it was as close to truth-based as possible. So that it's probably a simple answer, I suppose.
And a good one, because, as I said, these characters really grab you and tug you in and pull you into the story, which makes it a book that it's hard to put down. Let's talk about the characters a little bit. You focus on one family in particular, two families come into here quite a bit. And there's one family in particular that you focus on. And you focus on these folks who are not political leaders. They're not industrial titans. They're not military people. They're pretty much everyday people, I think it's fair to say. And which gives them a certain resonance, I think, that perhaps they wouldn't have it if they were in some kind of social hierarchy that would cause you to wonder what was going on. What brought you to these particular people, the two families that you spend your time on?
What I learned, and I did extensive research, reading, watching documentaries, reading some of the ICTY proceedings, news articles, personal narratives. And what I found fascinating is that here in the West, that genocide, that war was being seen or depicted as long-standing ethnic tensions, and they're at it again. This is the norm for them, and it really wasn't. It was not. As I mentioned, people coexisted quite peacefully. It was the nationalistic rhetoric of Milovic and Karadzic and others that turned it into the genocide. But when and I think hearing that there are ethnic tensions, it's easy to turn away and say, well, here they go again. Mm-hmm. But these were normal, everyday, we can relate to people. Mm-hmm. Elvir runs he's an entrepreneur and he has his own import-export business. His brother Tariq is a police officer. Mm-hmm. At the beginning, we see Amir, who's the 15-year-old son of Elvir and Hira, racing home after a soccer match, and he's so proud of himself, and his younger brother, idolizes him. This could easily happen here in America. You could see this family in America. And I think I know I wanted to just normalize their lives. And yet, as you see pretty much in chapter 3 and on, their lives are anything but normal.
Yes. And the first 2 chapters are deceptive. And I don't mean that in a negative way, because you do set this kind of middle-class Bosnian families, everyday experiences, stuff that we would do. They're out on a picnic at one point by the lake. I mean, it's beautifully done, because it's so shocking then when we go into the concentration camps where they are. Kudos to, as a reader, thank you for really making, I don't know how you did it, that first part where the shelling starts in the city and they run down to their basement, that just really sang out to me as a real experience. It seemed something, unfortunately, that could happen pretty much anywhere. One thing that I was struck by, and I felt a little guilty about being struck by this, but the title that you give the book allowed me to talk about it, I think, and that is the resiliency of these folks, and almost the optimism by the time we come to the end of the book. The book is titled "And Still We Rise," which I presume is a deliberate choice on your part of making this not a negative book, even though there are a lot of horrible things that happen to these folks during the course of their existence in the book. What can you tell us about that resilience? And is optimism going too far?
It's interesting. I'll take you back to, I work with the art designer of Atmosphere Press, the company that published the book. And we came to an agreement, and I agreed to the cover, as you showed. But the flowers were wilted. The flowers in the front of the book. I don't know if you can show that.
Back up again.
And my wife and I and others in my family, my daughter and son, they say, those you've talked of the many people I've spoken with who speak of hope, regardless. Hope was always present. And so the "And Still We Rise," really, I reflect on the hope that they had, even through the misery that they would eventually, and at times, certainly they didn't always have hope. And there was certainly feelings of despair, many feelings of despair during this. But, as particularly as they are exiting those who exit the concentration camps, they begin to feel and are seeking some sense of balance, and find their ways as refugees through to realizing, for the most part, some of that hope that they had. They can never turn back. They want to go back to Bosnia. They miss Bosnia, but they know that they really can't return. So in their quest for some sense of balance and healing, that hope, the flame of hope, seems to still be there for these characters. And it's not unlike many of the people I've spoken with, and not unlike what Satko relayed to me about his own experiences. So I did want to make sure that it was not all despair and tragedy, because for many survivors, it is not. Now, they carry the trauma for their lives, and it affects people in different ways. But I can't tell you how remarkable many of the people I have met are, despite that experience. So I wanted to make sure that came through the characters in the book.
I think it certainly does. And I want to talk about the characters a little bit more. But first, you mentioned the last part of the book sees our characters moving out of Bosnia and going to Germany, and then going to America. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that journey that the folks that you spoke about in your presentation, where the diaspora did end up. And then if you could tell us a little bit about that immigrant experience, because that part of the book spoke to me too. I'm second generation, but my grandparents were immigrants from the old country, as they said. And so I have a little idea, and I'm sure many of our viewers, listeners have that as well in the background. America has so many immigrant families in it. And these folks are truly emigrating from a horrible experience, coming to America, coming to Germany, and trying to start new lives. And you I think, do a great job of beginning to explain how that process works. Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, they actually first went to Croatia, which was a safe haven for a time, and that's where they went. And by the way, in Croatia and in Germany and the U.S., for each character, to me, they're sort of representational of what people, I suppose, any refugees might feel, but particularly those who are escaping such brutality and such atrocities. So I focus on individual characters and the experience that they're going through at particular moments in their lives, from Croatia through Germany to Utica, New York, to the U.S. But I think you're right. There's sort of a universality there. And I'm sorry, can you repeat just the last part of your question?
Sure. What that immigrant experience was for these folks, because they're coming into the country at a different time and a different place than many of us, our ancestors, may have.
Thank you. And I also see, I have my grandparents escaped the pogroms. They were persecuted as Jews, and certainly I have a sense of that. And I know, although my parents didn't speak a lot about it, I know that we lost family members in the Holocaust. And I think that drew me and continues to draw me to Bosnia and what's gone on there, and current day denial of the genocide and sort of what's going on presently. But in terms of the immigrant experience, I certainly have a sense of that from my own family. Also, in terms of the journey that they took, the reason that some of the characters, the family that I follow, or actually the two families I follow throughout the book, moved from Germany is because in the mid-90s, the German government was getting a bit queasy about having Bosnian refugees, and there were some laws, I guess, imposed in Berlin and other places in Germany that were, in a sense, requiring Bosnians to either go back to Bosnia, to a third country. And so in the book, people are feeling uncomfortable now. And so typical of I suppose, of refugees and immigrants, Not always. Certainly somebody has to pave the way, but the families go to Utica, New York, and I happen to know Utica fairly well. My wife's from there, and there's a large Bosnian community, and I know people there. They went because other relatives were there, and there's a comfort level. And in many instances with immigrants, that's what happens. So they finally settle in Utica, and that's a couple chapters later, but that's where the book ends.
Yeah. Can you talk with us a little bit about? I found it interesting that there is a real focus on the Bosnian Muslims in the book, and there's not a lot. There is some, as you pointed out to me, there's not a lot on the Serbs, and you don't spend a lot of time writing about the Serbs who were attempted to be supportive of the Bosnian of their Bosnian Muslim neighbors. Can you tell us a little bit about your knowledge and about how that came into the book for you?
Sure. With Satko, and again, he was very instrumental in speaking to me about his experiences in Bosnia and in the concentration camps. At first, when I read about and learned about what happened in Prijedor in particular, but certainly in Bosnia, I was angry. I felt anger. And Satko, who looked at my manuscript and really helped me kind of work through some of that stuff, he said, you're demonizing the Serbs, and you can't do that. He said there really were some Serbs who did help and tried to help. So there are, I think, at least 3 sort of almost vignettes of where Serb neighbors are risking their lives really for helping out Bosniaks. But the story really, is about what happened to Bosniaks because of their ethnicity and their religion. One other thing, it also fascinated me, and I prefer to use the term Bosniak because, and even today, Rhetoric, who I mentioned in the presentation, is not a good man, and he's once again heating up the rhetoric to secede from Bosnia, and hate speech, is coming from him again. But he'll use the term Muslims, and he won't say Bosniaks. And that is specifically designed, as I said about the 7th grade social studies class that I taught, specifically designed to evoke very negative stereotypes. But the book, I wanted to create some vignettes of stories where Bosnian Serbs did help, but that wasn't going to be the primary focus.
And I think it clarifies the narrative too. It makes it focusing on these 2 families and their travails and their victories really clarifies the story, I think. It is a definite plus for the way you wrote. You mentioned, and I think Sarah mentioned, your background, and I'm just curious how your background in social work and in teaching informed the novel, or whether it had any way of influencing what you wrote at all.
Yeah, no, I truly believe it did. I wrote a book a few years ago. I self-published it called Our Neighbors, Their Voices, True Stories of Immigrant Exodus. And at the time, the immigration policy in this country called for quite a bit of restrictions, demonization of migrants and immigrants. And I interviewed 14 people who came to this country from different countries like Lebanon and Iran, Mexico, Guatemala. I interviewed my wife, who came from Italy to actually leave poverty and for economic opportunity. And then I, knowing my own background with grandparents escaping pogroms. So I for that book, I interviewed 2 women who were children at the time in Bosnia. And I knew that I knew there was a big Bosnian population in Utica growing, but I wasn't curious enough to know why they had come. So that certainly informed my and spurred my interest. But also at the time, I had been a social worker for 22 years. I was a clinical social worker for a while. I worked with people who had experienced trauma and certainly knew about trauma and what it did to people and how people tried to heal. And also, I was a teacher at the time in a community that was mostly Latinx. And these were sixth grade kids. They were really worried about ICE visiting their house and taking their parents away. So all of this and writing of the other book and meeting these two women who were children at the time of the war, of the genocide, certainly did inform me and inform my writing of the current book.
And I think your background also really informs the book, and it also gives these characters some real resonance because when they're going through these horrific times in the concentration camps, and then when they're going as immigrants as well, I think you offer insights that other folks might not be able to offer in terms of what they were feeling. And that makes these characters come alive for me as a reader.
Right.
They're not cardboard characters. Thank
you. The other thing, just to, maybe this is a little more Americanized in a sense, but I know from the Bosniaks I've spoken with, emoting feelings, at least I think things have changed a bit, but seeking support, whether it's, groups or speaking openly about what one has gone through, seeking counseling, is not something that's commonplace. So, I say this it's not for me to give permission, but in a sense, in the book, because some of the characters do seek help, it's giving permission to anyone who's experienced trauma to say, you know what, I can't just do this on my own. I do need some help. It is blocking me from feeling better about my life. So I think there's no question that my social work background comes to play there.
That's cool. I'll wrap up with this question and leave it nice and open-ended. You can go where you wish with it. The book takes us into the Bosnian world before the first couple of chapters, as you noted, then really delves deeply into the horrific conditions that these folks survived in the concentration camps during the genocide, and then into the immigrant experience when things are still dicey, but at least it's a little more, they can see hope more clearly in front of them. If you were going to write the book again, would you change the way you present the story to us? Would you change this, not so much changing the story, but would you change the arc of the story? Or are you really happy with the way you have presented it? I hope if you haven't read the book, and I know you have, if folks have not read the book, I truly encourage you to do so. It's a powerful and very moving story. And knowing that, would you write it differently if you had the opportunity?
It's a question I have not thought of. I would have to think about that. I mean, at this point, I'd say no. I mean, the way it developed and how it's come out really speaks to what I wanted to present to the reading public. Many people know nothing about Bosnia, know very little about the genocide or the war, certainly don't know much about Bosnian culture. I didn't. I have learned so much in this journey, and the journey continues for me. As Sarah mentioned, I'm now part of particularly the working group for Bosnia and Herzegovina, because advocacy and activism is needed because of the current situation in Bosnia is actually as close to violence again as it had been in the early 90s. So it's sort of a journey that continues for me. Your original question, though, at this point, no, I wouldn't change the book. I think it presents a pretty clear picture of what it was like and what it's like for people going forward.
Yeah, and in the end, I as a reader, I totally agree. It's about resilience. It's about making their way through a world that they had no idea, totally unknown to them. and unknown to us as readers. And yet it's quite a wonderful, powerful read. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
You're welcome. I'm going to, if you haven't read it, check it out at your local bookstore, online bookstore. Go to your library. Please go to your library. Ask them, make sure they have it, because this book needs to be around and needs to be around for a long time. I'm going to hand over to question and answer with Rebecca, and if you would like to take the mic, and let's find out what folks are curious about.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Jordan, for this lively conversation. Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for joining us for this discussion with Jordan Stephen Sher, this fall's 40th Annual Greater Lafayette Holocaust Remembrance event. My name is Rebecca Klein-Peshavat, and I'll be moderating the question and answer portion of the program. It's an honor to be here and take part in the program. So I'm talking from my office on Purdue campus, and I just want to reiterate that we're talking today on a day, December 9th, that we can think about when the UN ratified the Convention of Genocide, which entered into force in January 51. In addition to that, we're aware that tomorrow is December 10th, and it's Human Rights Day. And it's a day when we reflect on ways to hold close human dignity and human rights protections. And so we've gotten a lot of very interesting questions here, and they're more or less in two kinds of clusters, a kind of cluster of questions that deal with historical events and a cluster of questions that deal with the book. And so I'll ask you, where would you like to start? Do you want to start with the historical events, or do you want to start with the book itself?
I honestly, either way. So whatever burning question you'd like to start with, I'm fine with.
Okay. So I will ask with, I'll begin with the question about Satya Muyajic. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to ask a little bit more about the nature of your collaboration on the book, and if you have any examples of advice, if there's one or two pieces of advice that he gave you that you could share with us that you felt really brought this book to life.
Yeah, thanks. So, in fact, Satko and I and David Pettigrew are going to be organizing a panel in January as well. So we've remained in contact. If you get the book and you read the foreword, and it's really a beautifully written foreword, because he says in the foreword what he said to me: if this book is not close to the truth, I will not only not endorse it, but I will not write a foreword as you're asking. Actually, I asked about the foreword later on, hoping that he would like what was coming about. He was very direct with me, which was very important. As I said to Nick, I was demonizing the Serbs. I also probably took a little too much liberty from what I had read in news reports, news articles, etc., to create characters that were not as authentic. And Satko helped me to create, in some sense, these authentic characters. He also he took the manuscript, and at least for certainly the first part of the manuscript, into the concentration camps. He would say to me, this is not quite accurate. It couldn't have happened this way. Your timeline is not right. And just share anecdotes with me. And it was quite instrumental in me again, making this book as authentic as possible.
Yeah. And so I like that. And there's, in addition to that, there's a question from the audience about how the Bosniak community has received the book. And, how do you feel that reception has gone? Do you feel good about the reception? Do you feel satisfied that you've presented a book in an authentic manner for them?
Mhm. I do. And I mentioned to Nick, I think perhaps at some point, and I think it was, I can't remember who, maybe my daughter or somebody said, or my brother actually said, at the end of the book, it's a little Americanized. And I said, well, I'm American born. I think most of the readers will likely be American born readers, but maybe not. So there is some of that, certainly. But I don't totally know how it's going to be received. However, I connect with lots of people worldwide who I consider allies and friends around this issue related to Bosnia. And many times I hear from them very genuinely, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. And I'm pretty demure about it because it's not just me, and I'm playing a very small part. But the fact that it's recognized that I'm trying to make this a much better known, though horrific, event in human history, and that it continues to happen, I've gotten a lot of support from those allies, many of whom are Bosniak.
Right, and we should remember that the book is very recently published. It just came out in October.
November 1st, officially.
November. So we're getting you about 4 weeks after the book is released, and maybe one of the first stops on your book tour, potentially. So it's something that we may not know as much about yet. We don't know about the reception as much yet. So along these lines, if we're still in this cluster of questions about the book, one of the questions is about your favorite character in the book. Is there someone who most resonates with you?
That's interesting. It likely the brothers, Amir and Danis, and their Elvir and Hira are parents, and this family is split up where Elvir and Amir, who is 15, are put into one concentration camp, Omarska, and Hira and children Halima and Dennis are put into Ternopolye. And as the characters evolved, I believe those are the two that I don't know, for whatever reason. It's not that I didn't feel, because I felt very connected as a father myself with Elvir. But I think from the children's perspective, what must it have been like for any children or any child to have gone through such trauma after leading these relatively, whatever normal, unquote, lives they led? And how did they come through after something like this? And they both did in their own ways. They had some challenges, particularly Dennis has challenges, but he's eventually on the road to figuring it out. So I think because they were children at the time, that I don't know, it really touched me in a way as these characters evolved.
Yeah. I can see that, and I can really see the background as a social worker coming through into this, the sensitivity with which you approach the characters in this book. You're helping them move through this story. There's a question here from Jaden Mifsud about how did the people you used as historical reference points influence the personalities of the characters in your book?
Let me try to understand the question a bit, if I can. Are we talking about people like Satko, or I'm not sure?
So what I think here, if I may, if the person who asked this question may contribute in the Q&A, but what I think is going on here in the question is thinking about the character as you evolved the characters in the novel, and you were drawing on real life experiences and real life characters to create those real life people to create those characters. what kind of influence, or so how did you, I think it's this kind of question, how did you create those characters? How are these collective biographies? Is it, is it based on one person? Or how did you manage that creation of the characters?
Well, thank you. Yeah. So I've said I've spoken to many survivors of the genocide, including adult children who were either quite young at the time or were born here in the U.S. And in fact, I'm in the process, though it's on hold now, but I will never forget, because I'm going to continue with that project. But many people who experienced and survived the genocide informed me in writing the characters, writing about the characters, or giving some sense of humanity to the fleshing out the characters, really, because of all the folks that I spoke with who are not, it's not just somebody like Sacco, who's amazing and an activist, or David Pettigrew, who's an incredible man too. But these were, again, everyday people who survived in different circumstances. One man I had mentioned earlier was in a concentration camp, shared his experiences. I talked to one of the women that I talked to in Utica. She and her family were from a place called Donja Vakuf, and they had to escape to Croatia eventually, and then the family were accepted as refugees in Pakistan, which is very different. And it also, because the experience of being Muslim in Pakistan is quite different than the experience of being a Bosniak, she was able to share with me the cultural differences that they experience, even in terms of food and dress and language. So just all of these types of things came to play, I think.
Thank you. And all right, I'll ask you this question too. As we're talking about the book and the influence of personal experiences, I wonder what were you doing at this time when these events were happening historically? And this will also act as a kind of transition question to the historical cluster of questions, because I know for myself that I had been at the time that these atrocities were happening not so far away. I was an exchange student in Budapest, and we were aware that something was happening, but it was almost a completely different sort of situation, not very far away. The early 90s had a completely different feel, just a bit further north of this, the excitement and euphoria and expectation moving into a new era. But still, people were constantly thinking of what was happening a few hundred kilometers away. And I wonder where you were at this time and how you first learned about the situation.
Well, I mentioned Utica, New York, where my wife's family immigrated to in the early 60s. And so we've been together a long time. We're still together. We very fortunate. And so we would go back to visit Utica. I lived in Albany, New York for a while. And then in the 90s, mid 80s, moved to San Diego. We'd visit Utica for Pina, that's my wife, for Pina's family, to get together. In the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, Bosnians were moving into Utica. And I would hear from family, maybe a bit stereotypical, but they'd say these are very hardworking people. They're fixing up the neighborhoods. They're fixing up houses. They're good neighbors. And I had just vaguely heard of what was going on in the early 90s. But I got to be honest, I was not curious enough to know why are they leaving and coming to Utica or other. I wasn't even necessarily aware that they were going to other places in the country. Quite honestly, it was not until I met those two women for my other book that I became curious. And once I learned about what happened, I was like, holy expletive. I can't believe I did not know, or for whatever reasons, not really take a great interest. And I think part of it too, Bosnians coming as refugees really wanted to assimilate, and I think wanted to leave behind their horrific experiences. So it just didn't become, it wasn't, I don't think particularly talked about or well known. Certainly has been since then. And so that really is it.
Thank you. Last semester in the spring, I taught the comparative genocide course, and there was a student whose family had immigrated to the U.S. And she said that they pronounced Judica, Utica, in the Bosnian way. So it's just
that's I'll remember that. I will.
So this now is a delicate question. It was one of the first questions that came in, and it's about the gendered experience of the war. And the question that first came in was, why did they spare women and children? And we know that there's the separation of men and boys or women and girls in this situation. And I wonder if you could speak to that question a bit.
I'm sorry, the question is, why did they separate?
Why did they spare the women and children from the gender difference of the experience?
Throughout the entire war, you're saying? Yeah. Well, first of all, the men and boys were seen as potentially fighting against Bosnian Serbs and military, so they wanted to eliminate that potential. And certainly, for a good deal, particularly early on, they did. I mean, imprisoning people in concentration camps, certainly slaughtering particularly men and boys, but they didn't discriminate. If in the villages, when the Bosnian Serb army or the militias entered villages, if people were fleeing, they gunned down anyone who was fleeing. They imprisoned others. But I don't know if I think in terms of the gendered experience, women and girls, as you saw, upwards of 50,000 women and girls were raped. They had raped the Bosnian Serb, particularly, the army and militias had rape camps. And, that experience, of course, is targeting in in a sense, in an equally horrific way. So it was all used for humiliation and intimidation, and just maybe in terms of gender experience, done in different in different patterns in different ways.
Thank you. So we'll move now to some questions about post-genocide accountability and recognition of the events in Bosnia and elsewhere. And the first one is a question from Sydney, asking, when Milovic was convicted of crimes against humanity, what was the response in Bosnia-Herzegovina?
Certainly joy on the part of Bosniaks and those allied with Bosniaks. And again, I don't want to demonize, because there is, a fairly small but activist group in Belgrade in Serbia that recognizes the genocide and the atrocities. But as I said earlier in the presentation, the glorification of Mladic and giving the aggressors Republika Srpska certainly reinforced, in a sense, that what they did was necessary for their own survival. And victimhood comes into play. There's continues to be sort of this us and them, this victimhood. There is, to this day, and I mentioned Milorad Dodik and others who are, continue to deny the genocide. Even even today, again, at soccer matches with involving Serbia, there are chants of Mladic's greatness. So there continues to be a tremendous division amongst how people react. And I suppose if you're brought up, for example, in Serbia or Republika Srpska, and your history books say that Mladic and others were heroes, then that's what you know. So it continues to be quite an issue for many of us who really are, in support of justice happening and reconciliation.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, there is a question from Gerald that deals with Western Europe. And the question reads, could you speak about Western Europe's relationship to what occurred? On the one hand, the modern EU was coming into being with the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 and the celebration of open borders. The borders were just opening at that time. Yet these atrocities were occurring in the shadows of these newly inscribed transnational boundaries. For example, how did the EU handle refugees? You mentioned the complex immigration policies in Germany in particular.
Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not a historian, but I can tell you from what I know, from what I've read and speaking with people, the EU and the West, the US as well, didn't want to get involved. And again, sort of pawn this off as longstanding ethnic conflict. And so it gave them justification for not intervening, including, other than Joe Biden when he was senator, including a U.S., sort of sponsored embargo of arms and weapons going to Bosniaks, and meanwhile they were being slaughtered. So it was not until 1995 under Bill Clinton that there were some airstrikes, and I think the Bosnian Serbs felt a bit threatened at that point. And subsequent to that was the Dayton Peace Accords. But no nations at that time, whether in Europe or the U.S., cared to get involved. Bosnia is a small country. Unfortunately, the humanitarian needs, they were seen sort of peripherally, but beyond that, there was not going to be any intervention. And the concern today is that the same thing is happening. Dodik is speaking of seceding from Bosnia. I don't know how he would, because it's an entity of leaving or creating his own military in Republica Srpska, leaving and establishing their own court system. All things that really should give us all pause for thought, and the U.S. and Western allies really need to be intervening more vigorously. And I'm not saying militarily, but there are many things that can be done. And even now, Russia, once again, is the bad actor, not wanting Bosnia to join NATO, and kind of as they're doing now on the border of Ukraine, they're involved. So it's almost a repeat in some sense of the lack of intervention, even political or economic intervention, that might have prevented the genocide.
Yeah. And this is what people are worried about right now. And yes. And this, I think you've answered a couple of questions that were here from the Q&A about the current situation, current political and social relationships between the Republika Srpska and Bosnia. But there's also a question here that deals with the political relationship between Republika Srpska and Serbia. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so Serbia continues to be a supporter of Republika Srpska, and also, and when I say Serbia, I'm talking about the government, particularly president, and like I said, there are activists that are looking to counter that denial, but Serbia now, in a sense, is also emboldened by Russia's involvement. And then you mentioned Budapest before, where you had been. Hungary, Viktor Orban is quite in line with other authoritarians and fascists. So Serbia as well is leaning that way. So they're really all in sort of working in some sense in concert with Republika Srpska. So that emboldens Republika Srpska to continue on the path that it's on now. it's a mess. Is that what we want to say? It's a mess. Yeah. And unfortunately, and I know those of you who follow this, authoritarianism and fascism is on the rise. And, there's this democracy summit coming up, I guess today and tomorrow. Don't know what's going to come. Unfortunately, Bosnia was not invited, and I'm not totally sure why. But there really is, as we see going on in the world, is quite a concern for a rise in fascism.
Rise in authoritarian styles of governance, right? For sure. So I'll move into another question here that deals with commemoration and memory issues. You had mentioned earlier this odd sort of commemoration at Omarska, but this prompted other questions about memory issues. How can we remember this event? There's an anonymous attendee who was wondering how can non-Bosniaks help? What is a good way that you feel to commemorate these events productively, meaningfully? And there's a connection to this with a question by Omarska about your book. Is there a connection between your book and how you see the function of your book and commemoration acts? And how do you intend to spread the book and publicize it? So it's a couple of questions, and you can enter into the answer however you like.
Okay, so yeah, I think for those who are not as familiar, and maybe by attending this conference have become more familiar, and like me of a couple of years ago, it's a matter of doing some research. Certainly my book, but there are many other books out, and I did basically searched. And I remember one of the articles I read was from pbs.org, and I think the journalist was Mark Danner. And his reporting about what was going on in Omarska just shocked me. And so I think, and it's not that you want your audience to be shocked, but I think if you begin to understand, and maybe through this conference and in my book and other books, you understand what's going on, and you can speak to not only what happened. We also need to be vigilant, and that's why I think I originally titled this Universal Lessons in Rhetoric, Rage, and Resilience, that we need to be vigilant about what goes on around the world, including our country, that we should be concerned about. And I think by understanding maybe what happened in Bosnia, you can understand sort of the pattern or the playbook around the world. In terms of celebrating, I would just search for what kind of commemorations continue or are happening in Bosnia. Now, for example, for Prijedor, May 31st is called White Armband Day. And that's to commemorate, because in Prijedor, Bosniaks had to wear white armbands and had to put white sheets outside of their window to identify that they're Bosniaks. Sound familiar, right? Yellow stars. And so as commemoration on May 31st, we wear white armbands. The genocide in Srebrenica, July 11th, is a day that's in fact, we were in Utica last July, and I participated in a march with the Bosnian American Community Association there in commemoration of in commemoration of the genocide. And there was something in Bosnia called the March for Peace, which is 3 days, goes from Tuzla back to Srebrenica. So I think it really is just a matter of one being interested in learning more and doing some research and doing reading. And then in terms of promoting my book, I mean, this is certainly a great way. I'm on January 9th is actually, I'm going to be hopefully presenting with Dr. Pettigrew and Satko on a panel. January 9th is when Republica Srpska celebrates its independence or statehood day. It is not a state. But it is really an awful day that they're recognizing. But we're going to have a panel then, in some sense, symbolically. But again, these things I also just learned about through my interest and my research.
Thank you. And thank you for writing this book, because I do think this is a way to tell the story. And often what people crave the most is acknowledgement of the story, and that there are people who recognize this and try to understand as best they can.
Yeah, can I also say in the book, I did put, there is a Bosnian alphabet if you want to improve upon your Bosnian, but there's also a resource page with other books, with some documentaries I'd seen and other things for people. So you don't have to necessarily search. If you get the book, in the back, there are other resources for the reader to explore.
And I want to ask one more question. It's a little bit lighter, as a way of wrapping up and transitioning. It's a question about food. So I thought one of the elements that really brought out the authenticity of the book, and you get a feel for the place and time and environment, was through the description of their meals and what they're eating, their foodways. And so the question is, what's your favorite Bosnian food? And have you sampled all of these foods that are mentioned in the book?
Well, I will tell you, I have to be honest. I have not had Bosnian food. I've had, well, I can't say that. I had some, well, here's what happened. Last July, I was in Utica, and I was visiting with my friend Dina, who I told you was from Donja Vakuf, and her family had escaped to Pakistan. Anyway, she and I had talked about this beforehand. She took me to a Bosnian cafe called Yummylicious. So here's some free publicity for Yummylicious Cafe. But I had Bosnian coffee, which I always heard is amazing. And in fact, it was. And then I had some other lunch food. I think it was, might have been something like moussaka, but something like that. But I will tell you too, I absolutely will be going to Bosnia. I have not been, but I will be going there. But because of the pandemic, I've not been able to in the summer. Typically, we go to Italy to visit my wife's family and beforehand go somewhere. Well, I will go to Bosnia, and then I will partake in some very real, official, delicious Bosnian food. Actually, one more thing. I did present in San Jose a couple of years ago. It was almost like a Bosnian wedding, but I presented on immigration policy, and they did serve Bosnian food. I can't tell you what it was or what I ate. It was pretty good. But I'll know more as I travel through my journey.
Thank you. And I have one comment here. It's not a question. It's from Marissa Safahic. It's not a question. She says, I want to thank you. As a child of Bosnian immigrants, it is nice to see others become aware and concerned about the atrocities that have happened in our country, considering that many people that I personally know have no idea about our history. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you, Marissa. Appreciate it.
And so we've had a good half an hour of conversation here, and I'd like to wrap up with many thanks to you, Jordan, for sharing your time and talking about your book with us. It means a great deal to all of us here, the students, educators, members of the community, the planning committee, and to me. And thank all of you for your questions and comments. Those of you who've contributed, who've participated in this event, thank you all for coming. And I'm now going to turn the floor back over to Sarah Powley. But before I do, please allow me to extend special thanks to her for her tireless efforts in bringing about this event and so many meaningful events over the years. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, Jordan. And thank you, Nick. Oh, your questions were wonderfully evocative, provocative, and the questions and the discussion and the answers were so thoughtful. You remind us, Jordan, that we must be vigilant. The Holocaust did not end genocide. And I appreciate, too, the resilience that is depicted in the story, because that's so important. Without the hope, there is no future. So thank you very much. I want to thank the audience for joining us tonight and remind you that Mr. Sher's book, And Still We Rise, is available at the West Lafayette Public Library, and it can be ordered online or from your favorite bookseller. Thank you to our sponsors in the community and at Purdue University, and to the individual donors who made this program possible. I'd also like to thank the committee members, especially Joe Sykos and Stacy Callahan, for their work behind the scenes, and the several members of the committee who helped this evening with the questions with Rebecca. So thank you all very much for attending the 40th Annual Greater Lafayette Holocaust Remembrance Conference, and have a good evening.